This is HOA property now. Vivian Carr shouted it directly into my face, her finger jabbing toward the metal sign bolted to my grandfather's 40-year-old wooden post. The words gleamed in the afternoon sun. Members only, HOA property. 3 weeks ago, I ignored their letter about lakefront compliance. Now they'd made their move. Her signature sat at the bottom, crisp and confident. I wanted to rip that sign down right there. She had no idea what was waiting in my basement. By the way, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I looked back at the house. Time to find out what Grandpa Walter really left me. 2 weeks. That's how long I'd been gone, finishing a restoration project in the city. The Hartwell building, 1897, needed its cornices rebuilt to original specs. Historic preservation was my specialty. I knew how to read old documents, verify authenticity, trace property lines back through decades of municipal records. It was a skill set I'd never thought I'd need for personal reasons. I pulled into the gravel driveway of Grandpa Walter's lake house just after 3 in the afternoon. The May sun hung warm over Clear Lake, and the water looked like glass. This place had been mine for 6 months now, since the funeral. I'd spent every other weekend here, slowly going through his things, not ready to change anything yet. The house itself was simple. 1 story, wooden siding painted that faded green-gray that happens when you're 50 yards from water and don't repaint every decade. Walter had built it himself in 1979, right after he retired. I remembered summers here as a kid, fishing off the dock at dawn, learning to identify wood grain. He'd taught me to measure twice, cut once, to respect what came before. I grabbed my duffel from the trunk and headed toward the lake. The dock stretched 60 feet over the water, weathered planks ending at an old wooden post where Walter used to tie his rowboat, except now there was a sign bolted to it. Shiny aluminum, professionally printed, secured with 4 heavy-duty screws driven straight through the wood. The letters were bold and black. Members only, HOA property. Below that, smaller text. Clear Lake HOA Board, President, Mrs. Vivian Carr. I stood at the edge of the dock, staring at the sign. The aluminum caught the light like it was mocking me. Rage flickered, but I held it down. This wasn't about emotion, it was about proof. Most of it was junk. Grocery flyers, a property tax notice, and there, third from the bottom, a letter on cream-colored stationery. Clear Lake Homeowners Association in serif font across the top. I opened it. The language was formal, almost friendly. Dear Mr. Grayson, as part of our ongoing efforts to standardize and maintain lakefront common areas, the HOA Board requests your cooperation in adhering to updated access guidelines for shared waterfront property. Details regarding membership fees and dock usage will be distributed at our next quarterly meeting. It was dated 3 weeks ago. I'd glanced at it, assumed it was generic HOA nonsense, and tossed it aside. Now I read it again. Shared waterfront property. They actually believed the dock was communal. I looked out the window toward the lake. The sign caught the light, reflecting like a mirror. This wasn't a mistake. This was a territorial claim. I heard footsteps on gravel and saw Howard Brennan walking along the lakefront path. He was 70, lived 4 houses down, and had been here almost as long as Walter. I stepped outside and called his name. He looked up, saw me, and his expression shifted. Guilt, maybe, or embarrassment. He stopped and said I was back, like it was something he'd been dreading. I nodded toward the dock and asked if he knew anything about that sign. He stopped, glanced at the water, then back at me. His hands went into his pockets. Vivian pushed it through at the last board meeting, he said. Said it was time to formalize lakefront access. Make it members only. I repeated the phrase back to him. Members only. This dock has been here 45 years. Howard shrugged, but it wasn't casual. It was the shrug of someone who'd lost an argument. She's got the board convinced it's for insurance purposes, he explained. Liability, upkeep, community standards. You know how it is. I didn't know how it was. I'd inherited this place 6 months ago and hadn't paid much attention to the HOA beyond signing the annual dues check. Walter had always kept to himself, never went to meetings, never caused trouble. I told Howard she couldn't just put a sign on my property. His face tightened. That's the thing, Ethan, he said. She's saying it's not your property. The dock, I mean. She pulled some old survey maps, claiming the waterfront belongs to the community. The HOA was formed in 2000, and according to her records, the lakefront access was part of the original covenant. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just the slow, precise awareness that this was going to be more complicated than ripping down a sign. I asked if my grandfather ever contested that. Howard shook his head. Walter didn't go to meetings, didn't argue. I think he figured if he kept quiet, they'd leave him alone. He paused. Vivian's been president for 8 years. She doesn't like quiet. I asked what he meant. She runs this place like a corporation, he said. Last year she fined the Parkers $200 for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of blue. They moved 3 months later. I processed that. A woman who fined people over mailbox colors had just declared my family's dock communal property. I asked if anyone voted against this. Howard's silence was answer enough. Finally he said he was sorry. He'd told her it wasn't right, but she said if I had a problem I could take it up at the next meeting. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. My advice? Don't fight her. She's got resources, a lawyer on retainer, the whole board behind her. I thanked him and watched him walk away. His shoulders were hunched, like he was carrying something heavy. I turned back to the house. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, I went to the small office Walter had used. His desk was still covered with his things, a coffee mug with dried residue at the bottom, a stack of woodworking magazines, and on the corner, a wooden box with a brass clasp. I'd seen it before but never opened it. It was his personal papers, birth certificate, discharge papers from the Navy, the deed to this house. I sat down and opened it. On top was an envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. The letter ended with a simple instruction: find the truth. I pocketed the key and headed for the basement, the weight of his warning settling over me. The letter continued. The lake was here first, he wrote, before the neighborhood, before the HOA, before all of them. I bought this land in 1947, right after the war, 15 acres, including 400 meters of lakefront. I've got the paperwork to prove it. If anyone tells you differently, don't believe them. My pulse picked up. 1947. That was 30 years before the neighborhood was even developed. There's more in the basement, the letter said, behind the old wine rack. A door. The key's in this box. Use it if you need to. I looked back into the box and found a small brass key tucked under the deed. It was old, tarnished, with the numbers 1947 engraved on the head. I held it up to the light. Outside, the sun was setting over Clear Lake. The sign on my dock reflected orange and gold. I thought about Howard's advice. Don't fight her. But Walter hadn't told me to back down. He'd told me where to find the truth. I stood up, key in hand, and looked toward the basement door. Whatever was behind that wine rack, it was time to find out. The basement stairs creaked under my weight. I hadn't been down here since the week after the funeral, when I'd come to shut off the water main before winter. The air smelled like old wood and concrete, that particular dampness that comes from being underground near a lake. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting yellow light across the space. Walter had used it for storage mostly. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old fishing gear, tools he'd probably forgotten he owned. And against the far wall, a wine rack made of dark wood, still holding a dozen dusty bottles. I walked over to it. The rack was heavy, built solid like everything Walter made. I pulled on the edge and it didn't budge. I tried the other side. Nothing. Then I remembered how he built things, never just one way to open them. I ran my hand along the underside of the top shelf and felt a small metal latch. I pressed it. Something clicked. The entire rack swung forward on hidden hinges, smooth and quiet despite decades of disuse. Behind it was a door. Not a modern door. This was old wood, painted a faded blue that had probably been bright once. There was a keyhole below a tarnished brass handle. I pulled the key from my pocket, the one with 1947 engraved on it, and slid it into the lock. It turned easily. The door opened inward, and cooler air drifted out. I found a light switch on the wall inside and flipped it. A fluorescent tube flickered twice, then held. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. 3 walls were concrete. The fourth, the one I'd just come through, was the only wood. There was a wooden desk pushed against the left wall, a metal filing cabinet in the corner, and hanging on the back wall, a large map. I stepped inside. The floor was concrete too, smooth and level. This wasn't a storage space. This was a workspace. Walter had built this intentionally, hidden it intentionally, and left it for me to find. I walked to the map first. It was hand-drawn, or at least hand-labeled, on what looked like a professional surveyor's paper. The title across the top read, Clear Lake Survey, 1947, Surveyor, Logan Pierce. The lake itself was drawn in blue ink, and around it, property lines were marked in black. One section was shaded in red. It covered the entire eastern shore, a long strip that included not just the waterfront but acres of land stretching back toward what was now the neighborhood. In the corner of that red section, written in neat block letters, was Walter Grayson, Parcel CL4 70089, 15 acres. I stood there staring at it. 15 acres. I traced the red line with my finger. It ran from a point north of my house all the way down past where Howard Brennan's place sat now, then curved back inland. The modern neighborhood didn't exist on this map. There were no houses, no roads, just open land and the lake. I turned to the desk. On it sat a leather journal, the kind with a strap that wrapped around to keep it closed. Next to it were 3 black and white photographs in plastic sleeves. I picked up the first one. It showed a young man, maybe 30, standing on an empty lakeshore. He wore work pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Behind him, the lake stretched out flat and empty. No dock, no houses, just trees and water. I flipped it over. On the back, in faded pencil, it said Walter Grayson, May 1947, first day. The second photo showed the same man driving wooden stakes into the ground, a mallet in one hand. The third showed him standing next to a surveyor's transit on a tripod. Another man crouched beside him taking notes. I set the photos down and opened the journal. The pages were yellowed, but the ink was still dark. Walter's handwriting, younger and sharper than the shaky script from his later years. The first entry was dated May 15, 1947. Bought the land today, 15 acres for $1,200. The bank clerk asked why I wanted property this far out. I told him I wanted space, peace, somewhere I could fish and not hear traffic. He laughed, said there'd never be traffic out here. We'll see. I flipped through the pages. Entries about clearing brush, building the first cabin, which wasn't this house but something smaller. Logs about weather, about fish caught, about watching the seasons change. Then, in October 1962, the tone shifted. They're building houses. A developer bought the land west of the lake, says he's putting in 50 homes, families. I don't mind neighbors, but I hope they respect boundaries. My deed is clear, registered with the county. The lakefront is mine. More entries followed. 1965. The neighborhood is full now, families everywhere, kids riding bikes. It's different but not bad. They leave me alone, I leave them alone. 1979. Built a new house, bigger, better insulated. This is where I'll stay. Then, 2000. They formed a homeowners association. Send me a letter inviting me to join. I declined. Don't need someone else telling me how to paint my fence. 2005. New HOA president, a woman named Vivian Carr, very organized, very insistent. She sent someone to measure my dock. Said there were questions about property lines. I showed them my deed. They left. 2012. Vivian came by herself this time, asked to see the original survey. I said no. She said the HOA has rights to maintain community standards on shared areas. I told her there are no shared areas on my land. She didn't like that. The last entry was dated 6 months before he died. If you're reading this, Ethan, it means they tried again. They'll wait until I'm gone. They think you won't fight. Prove them wrong. Everything you need is in this room. The deed is in the filing cabinet. The survey maps are behind the ones on the wall. The coordinates are in red. Don't let them rewrite history. I closed the journal and turned to the filing cabinet. It was locked, but the key was taped to the underside of the desk drawer. I unlocked it and pulled the top drawer open. Inside were folders, labeled and organized. Original deed, 1947. County registration, 1948. Survey report, Logan Pierce, 1947. Property tax records, 1947 to 2024. I pulled out the deed folder and opened it. The document inside was on thick paper, slightly yellowed but perfectly intact. It laid out everything in formal legal language: parcel number, coordinates, boundary descriptions, and 412 meters of waterfront access. I photographed every page. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the county assessor's website. I typed in the parcel ID. It took 3 seconds to load. The result came back. Parcel CL470089. Owner of record, Walter James Grayson, deceased. Transfer pending estate settlement. The property was still in his name because probate hadn't finalized yet, stuck in the bureaucratic gap between death and inheritance. My hands went cold. After 77 years, the parcel was still active in the county system, which meant every tax bill I'd paid, every piece of mail I'd received from the county, had been tied to this exact property boundary. The boundary included 412 meters of lakefront. I looked back at the map on the wall. If that survey was accurate, the HOA wasn't just wrong about my dock. They were wrong about the entire eastern shore. Every house along this stretch, every manicured lawn running down to the water, every community fire pit and shared beach access sat on land that had never stopped being mine, or Walter's, or whoever held that deed. The scope of it hit me like cold water. This wasn't a dispute over a wooden post. This was a question of whether 77 years of records and registration meant anything at all. And if they didn't, then what exactly had I inherited? I stood there in that hidden room, surrounded by Walter's carefully preserved evidence, and felt the full weight of what he'd left me. This wasn't just about protecting a dock. This was about whether truth still mattered when everyone had agreed to forget it. I took one more photograph, this time of the full map, making sure the parcel boundaries were clear. Then I turned off the light, locked the door, swung the wine rack back into place, and climbed the basement stairs. Upstairs, the sun had set completely. The lake was dark outside the window, and I could just barely see the outline of the sign on my dock. Tomorrow, I'll start making calls. But tonight, I sat at Walter's desk and wrote down everything I'd found. The parcel number, the surveyor's name, the date of the original deed. The coordinates that proved the red-shaded section on that map wasn't history. It was current law, waiting to be enforced. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote one more thing. They don't know what they're dealing with. Tuesday morning, I called the county land records office. The woman who answered sounded tired, like she'd been answering the same questions for 20 years. I told her I needed to verify a parcel registration and possibly update ownership following an estate transfer. She asked for the parcel number. I gave it to her. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. She said the parcel was active, registered under Walter James Grayson, marked as estate pending. I asked what that meant for the recorded boundaries. She said the boundaries don't change with ownership. Whatever was filed in 1947 would still be the legal description unless someone had filed a subdivision or amendment. I asked if there had been any amendments. More typing. Then she said no. Nothing since the original registration in 1948. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called a surveying company. Not just any company. I needed someone who understood historical land records, someone who could take a 77-year-old map and verify it against modern GPS coordinates. I found Precision Land Survey Company online. Their website showed projects involving disputed easements, boundary corrections, and forensic land analysis. I called and explained the situation. A man answered, said his name was Landon Pierce, that he was the lead surveyor. I told him I had a 1947 survey map and needed it verified against current county records and physical markers. He asked if I suspected encroachment. I said yes. He said he could come out Thursday morning. Wednesday, I went back to the basement. I spent 4 hours photographing every document in that filing cabinet. The original deed. The survey report signed by Logan Pierce. Tax records going back decades, each one listing the same parcel number, the same acreage, the same boundaries. I found a folder labeled Correspondence and opened it. Inside were letters. One from 1963, from a developer asking Walter if he'd consider selling a portion of the lakefront for residential access. Walter's reply, carbon copied, was polite but firm. The lakefront is not for sale. It will remain private property. Another letter from 2000, from the newly formed HOA, inviting him to join and contribute to shared community resources. Walter had written "declined" across the top in red pen. Then I found something else. A letter from 2014 on HOA letterhead, signed by Vivian Carr. It was addressed to Walter. The tone was different from the earlier invitations. It was formal, almost legal. Dear Mr. It has come to the attention of the Clear Lake HOA board that certain waterfront areas previously assumed to be community property may require boundary clarification. We request access to your property for a professional survey to establish clear lines of demarcation in accordance with county regulations. Please contact our office to schedule a convenient time. Below that, in Walter's handwriting, he'd written a single word. No. There was no other response. No letter sent back. Just that one word, and then nothing. I photographed the letter and added it to my folder. The pattern was clear. The HOA had been pushing for years, first with invitations, then with requests, then with demands. And when Walter refused to cooperate, they'd waited. Waited for him to die. Waited for someone less informed to inherit. Someone who wouldn't know the history. Someone who might just accept their version of reality because it was easier than fighting. I closed the filing cabinet and looked at the map on the wall again. The red boundary line was clear, precise. It ran along the entire eastern shore, from coordinates marked at the north end to coordinates marked at the south. If those coordinates were accurate, then my property didn't just include my dock. It included Howard Brennan's shoreline. It included the stretch where the HOA was building their community dock. Thursday morning, Landon Pierce arrived in a white truck with Precision Land Survey Company printed on the side. He was 50, maybe older, with a weathered face and the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. He brought 2 assistants and a collection of equipment I only half recognized: a GPS unit on a tripod, a laser scanner, orange flags on wire stakes. I showed him the map from the basement. He studied it for a long time, running his finger along the boundary lines, checking the coordinates written in the margins. Then he looked up at me and said this was a federal survey. The kind done by government surveyors after the war when they were parceling out land. If the markers were still in place, this map was as good as law. We walked the property line. He started at the north end, where the coordinates indicated the first boundary marker should be. It took 20 minutes of searching through overgrown brush before one of his assistants called out. There, half buried under decades of leaf litter and soil, was a concrete marker. It was old, weathered, but intact. The top was flat and smooth. Carved into the surface were numbers. CL470089. Landon crouched down and brushed the dirt away. He set up the GPS unit directly over the marker and took readings. Then he pulled out a tablet and compared the numbers to the coordinates on Walter's map. He looked at me and said it was a perfect match, down to the centimeter. We moved south, following the boundary line. Landon explained that in 1947, surveyors used physical markers, usually concrete or stone, placed at key points along property lines. If we could find even 2 or 3, he could verify the entire boundary using triangulation and GPS overlay. We found the first boundary marker buried under decades of soil, a concrete post etched with the old parcel number. Landon set up his GPS and compared the readings. Perfect match. 2 more markers confirmed the same line, and by early afternoon, his overlay map told the story. The HOA line sat 3 meters too far inland, just enough to steal every inch of waterfront. I asked how significant. He did some calculations on his tablet, measuring the length of the disputed strip and the width of the offset. Then he said the total area was approximately 3 meters wide and 400 meters long. About 1,200 square meters of land. Not huge, but enough to matter. Enough to include every access point, every dock, every beach area the HOA claimed as community property. He asked if I wanted a full report. I said yes. He said he'd have it ready by Monday, complete with GPS coordinates, photographs of the markers, and an overlay comparison showing the legal boundary versus the assumed boundary. I thanked him. He packed up his equipment and left. I stood there on the shore looking at the water. 3 meters. It sounded small. But 3 meters was the difference between private property and public access. 3 meters was the difference between Walter's truth and Vivian's assumption. 3 meters was everything. I walked back to the house and sat down at the desk. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email. Not to the HOA. Not yet. First, I needed a lawyer, someone who specialized in property disputes, someone who understood that this wasn't about being difficult or territorial. This was about the fact that legal boundaries don't disappear just because people forget they exist. I found a law firm downtown, sent an inquiry, and within an hour, I had a response. A real estate attorney named Claudia Reese. She could meet Friday afternoon. Friday, I brought everything. The map, the photos of the markers, the deed, The journal. Claudia's office was small but organized, shelves lined with legal texts and case binders. She listened while I explained the situation. Then she reviewed the documents. She spent a long time on the deed, cross-referencing it with the county's online records. Then she looked at the survey photos Landon had sent me as a preview. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and said this was unusual but not unprecedented. Boundary disputes based on historical surveys happened occasionally, especially in areas that had developed quickly. The key was whether my documentation was stronger than theirs. I asked if it was. She said absolutely. A recorded deed, physical markers, and a professional survey gave me everything I needed. The HOA's claim was based on assumption and tradition. Mine was based on law. She asked what I wanted. I said I wanted them to stop claiming my property as theirs. I wanted the sign removed. I wanted acknowledgement that the dock and the shore it sat on belonged to me. She nodded and said we'd start with a cease and desist letter, formal, legal, giving them 7 days to respond. If they refused, we'd file for an injunction to stop any construction on the disputed land. And if it went further, we'd sue for trespass and demand they remove any structures they'd built without permission. I asked how long it would take. She said it depended on their response. If they were reasonable, maybe a few weeks. If they fought, maybe months. I told her to send the letter. Monday morning, Landon sent the full report. It arrived as a PDF, 43 pages, with the kind of technical precision that makes lawyers smile and opponents nervous. Inside were photographs of each marker, GPS coordinates down to the decimal point, overlay maps showing the legal boundary versus the HOA's assumed line, and a summary that used words like incontrovertible and legally binding. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Claudia. She called me 30 minutes later and said this was exactly what we needed. The report wasn't just good, it was bulletproof. Tuesday, Claudia sent the cease and desist letter. The language was formal but clear. It stated that I was the legal owner of parcel CL4 70089, that the parcel included 412 meters of lakefront property, and that any structures or claims made by the HOA within that boundary constituted trespass. It demanded removal of the members-only sign within 7 days, cessation of all construction on the community dock, and written acknowledgement that the disputed area was private property. It cited the deed, the survey, and the physical markers, and it ended with a line Claudia had insisted on. Failure to comply will result in legal action including injunctive relief and damages. Wednesday morning my phone rang. The caller ID said Vivian Carr. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice was tight, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from practiced authority. She said she'd received a letter from my attorney and wanted to discuss it directly. I told her anything she needed to say should go through Claudia. She said that wasn't necessary. We were neighbors. We could work this out like reasonable people. I asked if she'd reviewed the survey report. There was a pause. Then she said the HOA had its own records. I told her records weren't the same as a legal survey. She said we'd see about that and hung up. Thursday, I got an email from the HOA board. The message said the board had reviewed my claim and found it inconsistent with established community boundaries. It said the HOA had maintained the lakefront as common property since 2000, and that 24 years of continuous use constituted a legitimate claim. It said they were willing to meet to discuss a compromise, but they would not remove the sign or halt construction without a court order. I forwarded it to Claudia. She called me 10 minutes later and said the adverse possession argument was nonsense. Walter had contested their claims multiple times. The letters in his files proved that. She said we should file for a temporary restraining order immediately. I agreed. Friday afternoon, we went to the county courthouse. Claudia filed the paperwork for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. The judge reviewed the documents and scheduled a hearing for the following Wednesday. In the meantime, he granted the temporary order. As of 5 p.m. Friday, the HOA was legally prohibited from any construction within the disputed boundary. The clerk stamped the order and handed me a copy. Saturday morning, I drove to Vivian's house and served it to her personally. She looked at the document, then at me, and said this was ridiculous. I told her it was legal. She said I was wasting everyone's time over a property line dispute that could be settled with a conversation. I said we'd had a conversation. Now we'd let the court decide. By Sunday, the neighborhood knew. I'd received 3 text messages from people I barely knew, one asking if the community dock project was canceled, one from Howard saying, "Call me when you can." I called him that evening. He said Vivian had sent an email to the entire HOA mailing list, explaining that a property dispute had temporarily delayed the dock project. She'd framed it as a minor administrative issue. Howard said people were talking. Some thought I was being unreasonable. Others were asking questions they'd never asked before. Questions about where the HOA's authority actually came from. Monday morning, I went back to Landon's office. I wanted to understand the 3-meter discrepancy better. Landon explained that when the neighborhood was developed in the 1960s, the developer had surveyed the available land, which was everything except Walter's parcel. But when the HOA was formed in 2000, someone had drawn up community maps without referencing the original county records. They'd assumed the lakefront was shared because that's how it had been used informally. Over time, assumption became tradition. Tradition became policy. And policy became law in everyone's mind except the county's official records. Landon showed me a comparison on his screen. The HOA's map versus his GPS survey. The difference was 3 meters along the entire eastern shore. He zoomed in on the area where the community dock was under construction. The concrete pilings they'd already poured sat 1 meter inside my boundary. The planned deck would extend another 4 meters, all of it on my land. I asked what would happen if the court ruled in my favor. He said the HOA would have 2 options: remove the structures or negotiate an easement. And easements aren't free. That afternoon, I received a call from the HOA's attorney. He said he'd reviewed my case and wanted to propose a settlement. The HOA would acknowledge my ownership in exchange for a permanent easement granting community access. No fees, just a legal agreement that preserved everyone's interests. The community dock project would continue, but the HOA would lease the land from me for $1 per year. I told him I'd discuss it with my attorney. He said the offer was good until Wednesday morning. After that, they'd fight it in court. I called Claudia. She said the offer was a tactic. They wanted to avoid the hearing because they knew their case was weak. An easement would give them legal cover for past encroachment and future plans, but it would lock me into an agreement I didn't have to make. She asked what I wanted. I thought about Walter's journal, about his refusal to let them rewrite history, about the principle that legal boundaries mean something. I told her I wanted to go to the hearing. Wednesday morning we'd present our case, and we'd let the judge decide whether 24 years of assumption could override 77 years of law. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the county courthouse, but by 8:30 my phone was already lighting up with messages. Someone had posted about the hearing on the neighborhood group chat. By 9 there were 23 comments, most of them speculating about what would happen, a few calling me selfish, others asking why the HOA had never mentioned the boundary issue before. I turned off notifications and drove to the courthouse. Claudia was already there, standing outside the courtroom with her briefcase and a calm expression that came from years of doing this. She asked if I was ready. I said yes. She said good, because Vivian had brought half the neighborhood with her. Inside, the gallery was nearly full. I recognized faces. Howard sat in the back row, looking uncomfortable. A couple from 3 streets over who'd sent me that text. Chase Bennett and Linda Orozco, the other board members, sitting beside Vivian in the front row. Vivian herself wore a navy suit and the kind of composed expression people use when they're confident they're right. Her attorney sat next to her, the same smooth-voiced man who'd called me with the settlement offer. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Patricia Wells entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every property dispute variation at least twice. She sat, reviewed the file in front of her, and asked both parties to present their cases. Claudia stood first. She introduced herself, introduced me, and laid out the facts in the kind of linear precision that makes complicated things sound simple. In 1947, Walter Grayson purchased 15 acres of land including 412 meters of lakefront. The sale was registered with the county. A federal survey was conducted. Physical boundary markers were placed. For 77 years, that parcel remained legally registered under the same identification number. Walter paid property taxes on it. He maintained it. He documented his ownership. When he died, the property passed to his grandson, me, through a valid will. The boundaries never changed. The registration never lapsed. What did change was that in 2000, a homeowners association was formed, and over the following decades, that association began treating portions of the registered parcel as community property without legal basis. Claudia placed the deed on the evidence table, then the 1947 survey map. then printed photographs of the 4 boundary markers Landon had located, each one showing the parcel number carved into concrete. Then the GPS survey report showing exact coordinates. Finally, she placed the overlay comparison, the one that showed the HOA's assumed boundary versus the legal boundary recorded with the county. She pointed to the 3-meter difference. That difference, she said, included every community access point, every planned structure, and the dock currently under construction. The HOA had been operating under an assumption. My client was operating under the law. She sat down. The HOA's attorney stood. His name was Richard Vaughn, and his strategy became clear within the first 2 minutes. He didn't dispute the deed. He didn't dispute the survey. Instead, he argued that the HOA's 24 years of open, continuous, and uncontested use of the lakefront constituted adverse possession, a legal doctrine that allows someone to claim property they don't own if they use it long enough without objection. He cited state law. He cited precedent cases. He said the HOA had maintained the lakefront, paid for improvements, and treated it as community property since 2000. No one had objected. Not Walter, not me, not until now, when construction had already begun. He called it unfair to suddenly enforce a boundary that had been functionally ignored for decades. Claudia stood for rebuttal. She pulled out copies of the letters from Walter's files. The 2005 letter where Walter explicitly told the HOA the lakefront was private property. The 2012 letters where he refused to allow a survey. The 2014 letters where he wrote no across the HOA's request for access. She handed them to the judge. Then she pointed out that adverse possession requires use without the owner's permission and without the owner's objection. Walter had objected, repeatedly, in writing. The moment I became aware of the encroachment, I objected too. There was no period of uncontested use. There was only a period where the HOA chose to ignore objections. That's not an adverse possession. That's trespass. Judge Wells reviewed the letters. She asked Vaughn if the HOA had copies of these objections in their records. He hesitated. Then he said the current board had taken over in 2018 and may not have been aware of correspondence from earlier years. The judge asked if that changed the legal validity of the objections. He admitted it did not. She asked if he had any documentation showing Walter had given permission for the HOA to use the lakefront. He said no, but the lack of enforcement suggested tacit approval. Claudia interjected. Lack of enforcement isn't the same as permission. Choosing not to sue isn't the same as granting rights. The judge nodded and said she'd heard enough. She asked both parties to sit. She took 5 minutes to review the documents again. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of pages turning. Then she looked up and said the law here was clear. The deed was valid. The survey was valid. The boundary markers confirmed the coordinates. The county records confirmed continuous registration. The letters confirmed that the owner had objected to HOA use. Adverse possession did not apply. She ruled that parcel CL4-70089 belonged to Ethan Grayson, that the boundaries established in 1947 remained legally binding, and that any structures built within those boundaries without permission constituted trespass. She made the temporary restraining order permanent. The HOA was ordered to cease all construction immediately, remove any structures built within the boundary, and remove the members-only sign within 14 days. Vaughn stood and asked if the HOA could negotiate an easement. The judge said that was between the parties, but the court's ruling stood regardless. If Mr. Grayson chose to grant an easement, that was his decision. If he didn't, the HOA had no legal claim to the property. She dismissed the case. The bailiff called the room to rise. Judge Wells left. And for a long moment, no one moved. Then Vivian stood, her face pale, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Marcus and Linda followed. Vaughn gathered his papers and left. Slowly, the gallery emptied. Howard stopped by me on his way out and said he was glad it was over. I thanked him. Outside the courthouse, Claudia said this was a clean win. The HOA would have to comply or face contempt charges. I asked what would happen to the dock they'd already started building. She said they'd have to remove it unless I gave them permission to keep it. And if I did, I could set terms. Fees, restrictions, whatever I wanted. It was my property now, legally and publicly confirmed. I stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the parking lot. A few people were still talking in small groups. I saw Vivian sitting in her car, staring straight ahead. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. This had never been about winning. It had been about making sure the truth didn't get erased just because it was inconvenient. I drove back to the lake house. The members-only sign was still on my dock, but now it felt different. Temporary. A mistake about to be corrected. I went inside and sat at Walter's desk. I thought about what came next. The HOA would remove their structures. They'd take down the sign. But that wasn't the end. That was just the correction. What happened after that, how the lakefront got used, who had access, that was the real question. And that was the question Walter had left for me to answer. Not with anger, not with exclusion, but with the same principle he'd lived by. The law matters. Boundaries matter. And once those are clear, then you decide what kind of neighbor you want to be. A week later, the county clerk mailed a single page confirming what the judge had already said. The land was legally, permanently mine. The same day, the county sent a separate notice to the HOA. I didn't see it, but Howard told me about it later. It outlined the violations. Construction without property owner permission. Placement of signage on private land. Misrepresentation of property boundaries in official HOA documents. The fine was $15,000, payable within 30 days. Additionally, the county building inspector had red-tagged the community dock project, which meant all work had to stop immediately, and any completed portions had to be removed unless the property owner granted written permission. The notice was delivered to Vivian's address and copied to the entire HOA board. By that evening, it was the only thing anyone in the neighborhood was talking about. Thursday morning, I received an email from Chase Bennett. He was one of the board members, the quieter one who rarely spoke at meetings. The email was short. He said the board had held an emergency session the night before. Vivian had resigned as president effective immediately. She'd also resigned from the board entirely. Marcus said he and Linda were now acting as interim leadership until a special election could be held. He apologized for the boundary dispute, said the board had relied on information that turned out to be incorrect, and asked if I'd be willing to meet to discuss next steps. The tone was different from anything I'd received from the HOA before. No assumptions, no demands, just a question. I replied and said I'd meet with them Saturday morning at my house. Saturday came. Marcus and Linda arrived at 9, both of them looking tired and slightly uncomfortable. I invited them in and we sat at the kitchen table. Marcus started by apologizing again. He said the board had operated under Vivian's leadership for 8 years and had trusted her research on property boundaries. They'd never thought to verify it independently. When I brought my survey and deed, they'd assumed it was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up. Now they understood it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a mistake. A big one. And they wanted to fix it. Linda asked what I wanted, not in a defensive way, in a genuine way. I told them I wanted the sign removed from my dock. I wanted acknowledgement that the lakefront was private property, and I wanted to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen again, to me or anyone else. Marcus said the sign would be gone by Monday. He'd remove it himself. As for acknowledgement, the board was already drafting a letter to all residents explaining the situation and correcting the record. They'd include a copy of the court ruling and an apology for the confusion. Linda said they'd also revise the HOA's governing documents to require independent verification of all property claims before taking any action. No more assumptions. Then Marcus asked about the dock. The community dock project had been a major initiative. They'd raised funds, held meetings, gotten resident buy-in, the pilings were already poured, the materials were already purchased. If I forced them to remove everything, it would cost the HOA over $30,000 and leave the community with nothing. He wasn't asking me to donate the land. He was asking if I'd consider leasing it. They'd pay a fair rate. They'd sign a formal contract. They'd acknowledge my ownership in writing, and in exchange, the community would have the dock they'd planned. I asked what they considered a fair rate. Linda said they'd budgeted $500 per year for maintenance and insurance. They could pay me that amount as a lease fee. I thought about it. $500 wasn't much, but that wasn't really the point. The point was whether I wanted to be the person who said no just because I could. Walter had fought to protect his property, but he'd also lived here peacefully for decades. He'd never locked people out. He'd just wanted them to ask first, to respect the boundaries. I told Marcus and Linda I'd agree to a lease, but with conditions. The lease would be for 5 years, renewable if both parties agreed. The HOA would maintain liability insurance that named me as an additional insured. They'd be responsible for all maintenance and repairs. And most importantly, the lease would include a clause stating that the lakefront remained private property and that access was granted by permission, not by right. If they violated the terms, the lease would terminate immediately. Marcus and Linda looked at each other, then nodded. Linda said those terms were fair, more than fair. They'd have their attorney draft the agreement and send it to Claudia for review. If everything looked good, they'd sign it within 2 weeks. I said that worked for me. We shook hands. They left. And for the first time since I'd found that sign on my dock, I felt like the situation was moving towards something sustainable. Not perfect, not erased, but acknowledged and accounted for. That afternoon, I walked down to the dock. The members-only sign was still there, but I knew it wouldn't be for long. I stood at the end of the planks and looked across the water. The lake was calm. A few boats drifted in the distance. This place had been Walter's refuge. Now it was mine. And I was starting to understand what he'd really left me. Not just land, but the responsibility to protect it, and the wisdom to know when protection meant enforcement and when it meant collaboration. Monday morning, Marcus arrived with a tool set and a screwdriver. I watched from the porch as he removed the sign, unscrewing each bolt carefully and pulling it free from the wooden post. He carried it back to his truck and drove away. The post looked bare without it, just old weathered wood with 4 holes where the bolts had been. I walked down later that day and ran my hand over the surface. The wood was rough, sun-bleached, exactly as it had been before any of this started. I thought about putting up a new sign, something simple. Private property, Grayson. But I didn't. Not yet. Let the post stand empty for a while. Let people remember what had been there and why it was gone. 2 weeks later, Claudia called. She'd reviewed the lease agreement. It was solid, clear terms, fair obligations, no loopholes. She recommended I sign it. I did. The HOA resumed construction on the community dock, this time with a permit that listed me as the property owner and them as authorized lessees. The project finished in 6 weeks. When it was done, it looked good, professional, well-built. I didn't use it much, but I'd see families there on weekends, kids fishing off the edge, adults sitting in lawn chairs. And that felt right. The lake was big enough for all of us, as long as everyone understood whose land they were standing on. 3 months after the lease was signed, I proposed something to the HOA board. Not through email, not through lawyers. I walked to Marcus's house one evening and asked if he and Linda had time to talk. We sat on his back porch, the lake visible through the trees, and I told them I'd been thinking about what came next. The dock lease was working, the boundaries were clear, but there was still a gap between what the community wanted and what the law allowed. I didn't want to be the person holding a deed over everyone's head forever. I wanted something more permanent, something that balanced my property rights with the community's desire for shared access. I asked if they'd ever heard of a land trust. Marcus said he'd heard the term but didn't know the details. I explained. A land trust is a non-profit organization that holds or manages land for a specific purpose. Conservation, public access, historic preservation. In this case, I was thinking about a trust focused on lakefront stewardship. I'd donate a conservation easement covering 60% of my lakefront property. That easement would guarantee public access to specific areas while protecting the land from overdevelopment. The trust would be governed by a board elected by neighborhood residents, rotating members every 2 years to prevent the kind of concentrated power that had caused problems before. I'd serve as an advisory member but wouldn't hold decision-making authority. The goal was to create a system that outlasted any individual, including me. Linda asked what I'd get out of it. I said clarity. Right now, every decision about the lakefront ran through me. Every request, every complaint, every idea for improvement. That wasn't sustainable. With trust, there'd be a formal process, transparent, accountable, and it would protect the land long-term, even after I was gone. I also said I'd retain 40% of the lakefront for private use, including my dock and the immediate area around my house. That was non-negotiable. But the rest, the parts the community had been using informally for years, would be formalized under the trust's management. Marcus and Linda both sat quietly for a moment. Then Marcus said it sounded complicated. I said it was. But it was the right kind of complicated, the kind that prevented future disputes. A week later, Marcus called a special HOA meeting. Not to vote on anything, just to present the idea. The meeting was held at the community center, and about 40 people showed up. I stood at the front with a printed presentation, maps showing the proposed easement area, and a draft of the trust's charter. I walked them through it step by step. What a conservation easement was, how the trust would operate, who would serve on the board, what it would mean for access and usage. I explained that this wasn't charity. It was a legal framework that made explicit what had been implicit. The land had rules. The rules would be written down, and everyone would know what they were. There were questions. Someone asked if this meant I was giving up ownership. I said no. I'd still own the land. The easement just restricted what I could do with it. I couldn't develop it, couldn't sell it for subdivision, couldn't revoke access arbitrarily. Someone else asked what would stop the trust from becoming another HOA, another power structure prone to the same problems. I said the charter included term limits, open elections, and a requirement that all meetings be public with minutes posted online within 48 hours. Transparency wasn't optional. It was built into the structure. Howard raised his hand and asked why I was doing this. I told him the truth. Because I realized Walter hadn't just left me land, he'd left me a method. Precision builds justice, and justice, when done right, builds community. The vote to support the trust formation passed with 36 in favor, 2 against, and 2 abstentions. It wasn't unanimous, but it was strong enough to move forward. Over the next 2 months, I worked with an attorney who specialized in conservation law. We drafted the easement. We filed it with the county. We established the Clear Lake Community Trust as a registered nonprofit. The first board election was held in early September. 7 seats, 14 candidates. The vote was conducted by secret ballot with an independent third party counting the results. Marcus won a seat. Howard won a seat. 5 others I knew by face, if not by name. I attended the first board meeting as an observer and watched them elect a chair, establish committees, and begin drafting usage guidelines for the easement area. In October, the trust organized its first public event, a lakefront cleanup day. Volunteers brought trash bags and gloves. We cleared brush, picked up litter, and repaired a section of eroded bank. More than 50 people showed up, including families with kids. It felt different from anything the HOA had organized before. There was no pressure, no mandatory participation, just people who wanted to take care of a place they'd been using for years and now had a formal stake in protecting. At the end of the day, someone set up a grill. We ate burgers and sat on the grass near the water. I talked with people I'd barely spoken to before, neighbors who'd been suspicious of me during the legal fight but now understood what I'd been trying to do. Not take something away. Make sure it can't be taken. Howard sat down next to me as the sun started to set. He said Walter would have liked this. The trust, the cleanup, the way people were taking responsibility instead of just assuming someone else would handle it. I said I hoped so. Howard said he knew so. Because Walter had spent his whole life protecting this place quietly, and now it was being protected loudly, out in the open, with everyone watching. That was the difference. I looked out at the lake, the same view Walter had looked at for decades, and realized Howard was right. The boundaries were still there. The property was still mine. But it wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to a system, a process, a community that finally understood the difference between using something and owning it. And that difference, more than any deed or survey, was what would keep this place safe. 1 year later, I stood in the basement archive room and looked at the map on the wall. The same map Walter had hung there decades ago. The red boundary lines still traced the parcel exactly as they had in 1947. But now there was something else. A new layer. A transparent overlay showing the conservation easement in blue, the areas managed by the Clear Lake Community Trust. The 2 maps together told the full story. What was protected by law, what was shared by choice. I'd added a timeline along the bottom. 1947, 1979. 2000, 2024, and now 2025. Each date marked a chapter in the land's history. Each one mattered. The room itself had changed too. It wasn't hidden anymore. I'd installed better lighting, refinished the floor, and added shelves for additional documents. I called it the Lake Archive Room now, and once a month, I opened it for public tours. Neighbors could come see the original survey, read Walter's journal, understand how property boundaries worked and why they mattered. It wasn't a popular attraction. Most months, only 3 or 4 people showed up. But the ones who came asked good questions. They wanted to know how land got registered, how surveys were conducted, how legal ownership transferred across generations. I answered what I could. When I didn't know, I found out and followed up later. Education, I'd learned, was the best defense against future disputes. The trust was working. Not perfectly, but consistently. The board met monthly. They'd established rules for lakefront usage, reserved hours for quiet recreation, scheduled maintenance days, created a fund for long-term improvements, money raised through voluntary contributions, and a few small grants. The community dock I'd leased to the HOA was busy most weekends, families fishing and kids jumping into the water under supervision. My private dock stayed private, but I didn't mind the activity nearby. It felt alive, used, respected. The trust's treasurer published financial reports quarterly, every dollar accounted for, every decision documented. Transparency wasn't just a principle anymore, it was a habit. Vivian Carr had moved away 6 months after the court ruling. I heard about it through Howard one evening when he stopped by to drop off some tomatoes from his garden. He said she'd put the house on the market quietly, no open houses, just listed it with an agent from the next county over. A young couple from the city bought it within 3 weeks. He'd seen the moving truck on a Tuesday morning, watched her direct the movers with the same brisk efficiency she'd once used to run board meetings. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't send a farewell email to the neighborhood list, just left. Howard said someone heard she'd moved to Arizona or Nevada, somewhere dry and far from lakes and property disputes. I asked if anyone had tried to reach out to her. He said Marcus had sent an email a few weeks before she left, something about wishing her well and hoping there were no hard feelings. She never replied. I didn't know if she left because of the embarrassment or just because it was time. Maybe the court ruling had been the final straw, or maybe she'd been planning to leave anyway, and the ruling just accelerated it. Either way, I didn't think about her much. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. She'd made a mistake, a big one, built a system of authority on assumptions instead of verification, and when those assumptions collapsed, so did her position. But she wasn't evil. She was just wrong. And the system had corrected it. That was the point of having laws and courts and records. No one person's error, no matter how confident or powerful they seemed, could permanently rewrite reality. The correction might take time, might require effort, might feel exhausting when you're in the middle of it. But it was always possible if you had evidence and patience. Walter had understood that. He'd prepared for it. Now I did too. In May, on the anniversary of the day I'd first seen that members-only sign, I went down to my dock with a cup of coffee and sat at the end. The morning was cool and quiet. The water was still as glass. A heron stood in the shallows 50 yards out, perfectly motionless, waiting for something only it could see. I thought about everything that had happened in the past year. The discovery in the basement, the maps and markers, the surveys and court hearing, the lease negotiation, the trust formation. Each step had felt overwhelming at the time, like I was building something without a blueprint, just reacting and adapting. But looking back, it formed a clear path, a logical progression from one decision to the next, from confusion to clarity, from conflict to resolution, from individual ownership to collective stewardship. I hadn't set out to change the community. I just wanted to protect what was mine. But in protecting it the right way, by proving rather than demanding, by building systems rather than asserting power, I'd created something larger than ownership. I'd created accountability. A family walked by on the path near the shore, the one the trust had widened and mulched last month. 2 parents, a kid maybe 7 years old wearing a bright yellow life vest. The kid saw me sitting on the dock and waved with both hands, that enthusiastic kid wave that uses the whole arm. I waved back. The father nodded in acknowledgement, one of those silent neighbor exchanges that says everything without words. They kept walking toward the community dock, the kid chattering about wanting to catch a fish. Simple, normal, unremarkable. That was the real victory. Not the court ruling, not the trust documents, not even the fact that my name was now on the deed. The real victory was that people could use this space, know the rules, respect them, and move through their day without drama or resentment or confusion about who had the right to be there. The boundaries were clear, the access was defined, and within that clarity, people were just living. I finished my coffee and stood up, feeling the dock sway slightly under my weight. Back at the house, I sat at Walter's desk, the same desk where I'd first read his letter a year ago. I pulled out a piece of paper, one of the cream-colored sheets he'd always used for important things, and uncapped a pen. I'd been thinking about writing something down, a letter like the one he'd left me. Not for a crisis, not a warning, just context, a record. For whoever inherited this place next, whether that was decades from now when I was old, or longer, when whoever came after me was gone too. This land had a story. That story needed to be written down while the details were still fresh. I wrote, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. The lake is still here. So are the boundaries. The deed is in the archive room, along with the original 1947 survey and all the documentation that proved ownership when it was challenged. The trust documents are filed with the county clerk's office. You'll own the land legally, but you won't own it alone practically. That's by design. Walter protected it for 77 years, mostly by staying quiet and keeping records. I protected it for as long as I could by making those records public and creating a system to manage shared access. Now it's your turn. Don't let anyone tell you the boundaries don't matter. They do. They're the foundation of everything else. But don't let the boundaries make you a stranger to your neighbors either. There's a balance between protecting what's yours and sharing what you can. Find it. And when someone inevitably tries to take what's yours, because someone always will eventually, don't get angry. Don't get loud. Get precise. Evidence, coordinates, documents, witnesses, professional surveys if you need them. Precision builds justice. And justice, when done right, builds community."
From all of us here at HOA Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.